just say La Cooperativa Hidroelectrica Montaña is Puerto Rico's first electric cooperative. We have 3 projects, just as a summary from the last time. We have Hidroenergía Renace, which is hydroenergy reborn. That's this hydroelectric plant is one of 3 hydroelectric plants that we will eventually acquire from the dead hands of PREPA once we finally relieve it of its last action. And then that will be community run. This will be basically a really good source of base generation for distributed energy network that we have envisioned. That is one tier of resiliency. On the opposite end of the tier of resiliency, we have Renfoco. Renfoco is Resiliencia Energética Fotovoltaica Comunitaria. That is roughly translate to community resilience through photovoltaics. That is 10 megawatts of rooftop PV plus 20 megawatt hours of storage distributed across 5 municipalities, focused on small businesses, community centers, including churches, and some residences. Residences only as needed to be able to power those small businesses. And that's because in the last case scenario of Huracán Maria scenario again, we want to make sure that we are providing services that will stabilize communities. And therefore, we don't see that necessarily as, with all due respect to Doña Pepa and Don Juan Pueblo, it doesn't come from residences. It actually comes from supporting small businesses that can provide multiple services. And here, a good example of that is that we already have 2 microgrids running under this project. And within one of those microgrids, we have a beauty shop. And everybody be like, well, you look at this guy here and you can see that hair has never been a big priority for me. And as a result, why would that beauty shop be important? Well, it turns out that in this community, the beauty shop is actually the community's bank. So all transactions, financial transactions of that community actually pass through the beauty shop. And as as the expression goes, you sit where you stand. One of my impediments is an appreciation for hair, but 50% of the population, at least 50% of the population, really cares about that. And one of the things that we began to appreciate is that when you lose like energy, things like being able to take care of oneself or being able to treat yourself to like something like hair care or a treatment is like that helps people feel better about themselves. And if they feel better about themselves, they feel better about their community. And that has a ever expanding reach. So energizing these small businesses, including some of the more classic essential services like a pharmacy, laboratory, medical clinic, grocery store, colmado, which you might know in some areas where, depending where you live, as bodegas, but those basically are Renfoco on the last end. So we have base generation with the hydroelectrics, we have Renfoco, and in between the two, we have Microred de la Montaña. That's microgrid of the mountain. That actually, through new 38 kilovolt kV segments, new grid scale batteries at the substations, and improvements to the feeders that will actually connect both projects, the base generation along with Renfoco, and will actually eliminate a lot of the outages that they experience. We have applications out for all of these. We've been invited to, for example, apply. Well, we're going to receive 3.4 million. Then we'll add on to there another 1.2 million about for microgrids with Renfoco. We've been invited by USDA as part of the PACE program to apply for 37 million. We've also applied for 80 million for Microred de la Montaña, plus another 40 million kicker for grid scale batteries. And then we have Hidroenergía Renace. So we have all of them. We're making incremental progress on all of these projects. There is it a Greek hero, the Greek hero that takes the boulder and pushes it up the hill every day, and then it rolls back down? What is that person called? What is that character's name?
Prometheus, I believe. I think it's Prometheus.
Say again, Stan?
Prometheus?
Sisyphus. What was it? Who's the Jessica?
Sisyphus.
Sisyphus.
Yes, Sisyphus. I'll drop it in the chat. Yeah.
Thank you, Sisyphus. So this is an ancient story, and there's times, and I say this to all of you, that there are times when in all of your projects you're going to feel like you're living out the life of Sisyphus. You know, like you take that task and you work it and you labor and labor and labor, and then you get that stone up there high enough on the mountain, and then it just comes down rolling upon you. And I think for anybody here that's in the PCEF world where you are really close to the ground, you know, very, very close to the ground, very much about carrying out these actions, there will be phases of these projects that will feel like that. And I think our challenge is to make sure that we do not fulfill that you know, we do not live out entirely that story, that ancient story, but instead we understand that there will be phases like that. And we certainly face that on a number of things. And the hydroelectrics are a good example of that. And then another example of that is what I'm going to be sharing here with about, you know, basically, you know, what the beautiful and the ugly and what resiliency can look like. And I think that that's pretty important. How many of you have done, most cameras are off. So I'd like to know how many of you have actually done electric studies on, you know, a demand study where you've actually studied, you know, some report that came from an actual consumption. Anybody? Zero? Okay. You can come off audio. You can yell at it. No, haven't. Yes. You know, I mean, if anybody has. Okay, I'm seeing Perry says no.
No.
Corey said no. Thank you, Corey.
No.
No. Okay. So what I'm going to show you is what electricity looks like with PV. And this is actual results from our microgrid.
Yeah.
And this is the actual ideal. So we're going to go through this really quickly. And this isn't an actual this is not an electric demand study. You know, the demand studies are what you use to actually size systems. So there's a lot of instruments that can do that, e-gauges, but basically they're power monitors. You hook up the power monitors, you know, to the 2 phases coming into the structure, 3 phases if it's a commercial entity. And then you can also have what are called current transformers, which are basically little loops that use induction with the wire going through there. And it tells you, it gives you a lot of information. It can give you like not just voltage, current, it can also give you the phase. It can tell you if it's real power, apparent power. There's all these calculations that it can do. And then basically those CTs, those current, they look round. They don't actually pierce the wire. They just go around it. And then you can have, you know, a number of those leads. So you can have it on various different circuits. This here, what you're looking at is an overview of the generation in the day. And this is actually kind of like the ideal for a PV system. PV with storage. And there's a lot of PV systems in the US that don't have storage. To me, I don't even understand the point of having a PV without storage. Some storage, you know, at least to keep the system alive when you're going to need it to come back on if the grid fails. And then at least you have energy at night. So what you're looking at here is basically time is your x-axis, and then the y-axis is going to be basically the amount of energy. And the different colors are the different coding. So you can see that like right around here at about, you know, 6 in the morning, well, let's call it like 6:20, the PV is first starting to feel the impact of the solar. And the first thing that it goes to is direct consumption. So this is energy that gets consumed on site immediately at the moment that the energy is generated. And at a certain point, you can see, I'm hoping you can see my cursor. Can you see my cursor or not? Okay, so cool. So then at a certain point, you know, all the consumption, and this also gives you a good idea of, you know, when these businesses come alive, you know, so you can kind of see like, yeah, there's some business that starts already working at 7:30, you know, but then, you know, it really kind of, you know, gets busy at around like 9:10 and it keeps on going there. But on in this color here, the yellow, what you're seeing is actually energy fed into the grid. So at a certain point, very early on, like from about 7:25, you know, 7:15 at some point a little bit, but definitely by about 7:25, 7:30, now you're starting to inject into the grid. So you're meeting all the needs of the businesses, and now you're injecting right into the grid. And this injecting into the grid carries on all the way until about 4:45 when the sun starts going behind the mountains. and then you can have a little bit here. And then at that point, then the rest is coming from the grid. And this is where net metering plays in, right? So if you can sum up the area, if you can imagine these colors here, these ribbons, as area, having an area, a dimension, time versus energy. Oh, wait, that can actually provide you an idea that over the whole consumption, over an entire 24-hour period, we inject into the grid more than we consume. And then that's when, if you have net metering, you can actually basically get a credit for what you inject into the grid. You have your direct consumption, and then from there, you get an economic benefit from that. Not all areas have net metering, but I would say as a policy, if you don't have net metering in your area or in your state, you should start organizing leaders to start putting a campaign together, because that would be a very important element. Okay, this is the ideal situation where, with net metering and this consumption, that you can basically see that the system is functioning. Now, what we really are trying to take care of is these situations. So this is what happens very frequently in Puerto Rico. So you'll have here, the grid providing some power, but then now we have some direct consumption and a little bit of injection into the grid. When it dips down like this, these are rainstorms. So what you're seeing is rainstorms passing over the system. So even though it's meeting all the needs of the current consumption, it's injecting less into the grid, right? And then the grid, has to take over. In this case, probably really bad weather, so now you can see it's not meeting all the consumption, and we're only at 2 p.m., 3 p.m., and it's assuming from the grid. But that bad weather, and I don't mean significantly bad weather. This could just be rainy clouds, like we sometimes joke around that we say 3 drops of rain and the grid goes out. And it kind of feels like that sometimes. So you have, this grid, but what you can see here is at a certain point at about, 8, 9 o'clock, thereabouts, the grid goes out. So now the grid goes out. So what you're seeing in orange here is that the batteries are now discharging. So the business, and why this is important, is this is what resiliency looks like. So you can imagine that you have the bakery with all the breads that have to go into the freezer or the cooler so that they can rise overnight, so you can start baking them in the morning. Or you can imagine that this is refrigeration for a laboratory that has to preserve blood samples and other things before they can be taken out, or medication at a pharmacy that has to be. So all of this has to be preserved, and a lot of this is refrigeration, in fact. Well, this battery now kicking in, covering this, allows for that community to resume when the grid comes back on. And that's actually what resiliency looks like in a technical aspect. Now this is actually what kills us, and this is where bad energy quality creates problems. So here you see a situation where, again, probably you can even mark when the rainstorm is there, where we're injecting less into the grid, but actually, no. This is when part of the demand comes off, like somebody tripped a breaker or something like that. But then you can see that it's not meeting all the needs around 1 p.m., but now we see points where the grid is coming off. So the grid is failing here. When you see these gaps in red, that's when the grid is failing. But look at how often that is. I mean, if you see here, this range on this x-axis is this 1 to 3 p.m., and we see 1, 2, 3 outages in just that hour, okay? And then you see this other situation here, which is within 2 hours from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m., and you see the grid, coming off and on. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 outages in that 2-hour period. And this is very hard on equipment. Most equipment, especially equipment that's designed for resiliency, is typically designed in kind of like a binary model. In other words, the system is on and it stays on. The system comes off and it stays off for a while. And now what we get into a situation where you have this cycling of all the equipment, be it batteries, be it, from grid scale power. And then what's worse yet is this kind of situation here, where you get so many outages in such a short amount of time that you start burning up equipment. And that is the reality that we face in our areas. We haven't. Uh, the incredibly weak grid, we have changed out 2 automatic transfer switches, which is what you're looking at here. This is the controller for the automatic transfer switch. We've also had to swap out inverter and then some other supplementary equipment. These automatic transfer switches, again, are not meant for a duty cycle. If you don't know what the expression of a duty cycle is, it's basically any equipment that you have has a certain expectation of cycles. How many times are you using that equipment? A good example of that is, let's say, like wiper blades in your car. It has a duty cycle, and you can even change it. You can change it to go really fast. You can have it go really slow. But even that duty cycle is not necessarily, even that wiper is not meant to run for, let's say, 24 hours. Whereas you might get some engines that can have a duty cycle, what is called continuous. These electric components, for them to switch back and forth, remember, these automatic transfer switches were not designed to have any duty cycle really per se. It is like basically power goes out, automatic transfer switch there. But they didn't conceive this kind of situation, which I'm presenting you here, which is a whole bunch of outages. And on that one particular, when I looked at it, there were 8 outages, that is 8 disconnects and attempts to reconnect to the grid in less than like a minute or 2 minutes. So that's very, very hard. And then on top of that, if you don't have this equipment, that is going straight to your refrigerator, straight to your other equipment in your house. And then that also reduces their lifespan because, again, they're not used to that. Some of the things that we learned with very poor quality energy is that we created more. It's not ideal. We would like it to be absolutely instantaneous in the sense that nobody would notice the loss of energy. But in our case, we've actually had to create a delay in there to allow motors like air conditioning motors, refrigerator motors, anything that goes time to start to wind down before we reapply the energy to it to bring it back up. That, of course, is harder on our equipment, but it's better for the beneficiaries of that equipment. One of the things that I wasn't able to share, so that's a technical nature there to see, what poor quality looks like, energy quality, and what resiliency could look like. But one of the themes that I wasn't able to share in the last time is that I believe that these distributed energy renewable resources and leadership by all of you within your organizations really is more limited by imagination than the technical solutions. In other words, there are technical solutions to meet all of your different needs. And I don't care if you're in Alaska, if you're in the Caribbean, Minnesota, Texas, the Gulf, it doesn't matter. There are a lot of different solutions out there. So I don't think the limitations so much are on technical. I think it's more limited by our imagination. And part of that is recognizing that through imagination, we can actually find and take advantage of additional benefits that these distributed energy resources provide. And one of those, of course, is community action. By embarking on a path where you start developing a renewable energy project, you actually necessarily empower the community. And that becomes then a call to action. And that call to action is something that percolates through other aspects. So you have definitely the development of the energy project, but as a result, you actually get involved in a lot of other things. So, for example, the Cooperativa, even though we're very clear on what we're trying to achieve, we've actually had to get into influencing policy development. We've had to approach the energy regulator. We have to develop more stakeholders, including within the utilities, and helping the utility understand that this actually is a benefit to these communities and it doesn't harm them. Um, all of that takes time, all of that takes more communication, but definitely my impression is that you can bring other people to the conversation that normally don't participate in these kind of decisions. And a good example of that is the opportunity to improve our communities. And one of our principal elements is employing and bringing in more women into the industry. And this is a very intentional exercise. If you can imagine, the energy industry in the 21st century is largely perceived as a necessity in life. There's very little that you can do to still be a part of the 21st century that doesn't involve electricity. And as a result of being basically a public good, then that is also requires high availability. And anything that requires high availability that's a public good tends to also be better compensated than a lot of jobs. And recognizing that the dollar in the hand of a woman is a better investment in the future than a dollar in the hand of a man, and in particular in Puerto Rico, I'll say this, that because a lot of the men turn that into present consumption, whereas a lot of women will turn that into an investment into their children. And as long as that principle holds, we believe that it is a great opportunity to improve our communities if we bring women into the organization and bring them into the industry. Now, I'm not, and then I think this is the key part here. If you think about an organizational structure, you tend to have more direct contributors and less leaders. And if you say, hey, we're going to bring in people that are inexperienced, where do you typically bring them in? You bring them in at the bottom. You're actually not fulfilling the mandate. You're actually, what you're doing is ensuring that you'll get more attrition from this group, and then you won't see that percolate, over, let's say, a generation, 15 years, 20 years, whatever it takes to be able to get towards the top. You make that commitment, you have to bring women in at all the different levels, irrespective of their experience level. And then you have to, as an organization, invest to address whatever lack they might have. Typically, it's not in people management or people skills. It might be technical knowledge, like, what is a synchronous condenser? What role does a synchronous condenser have? How does that support voltage and frequency control? Well, that's technical skill that you can teach people. You can bring them up to speed so they have the context of how a synchronous condenser at a substation is an important element to strengthen overall grid. But then they are coming in at that level. And in that way, when you bring in diversity into the organization, not for just for some quota, but actual an element of intentional design to mature the organization quicker, well, then each person that you enter into that organization becomes a champion for their people. And testing that hypothesis, we've actually had some really good outcomes there by addressing whatever shortcomings a person might have, but more importantly, building up a more solid organization. I have full intention that when I leave the Cooperativa, that my relief is a local woman from within the mountains, and I think that is going to be a very important commitment by the board of directors and the membership as a whole of the cooperative to make sure that this organization is as inclusive as possible. Ultimately, all of this together, the distributed energy resources, the projects, the programs that we're running, all of it is ultimately to address the aspect of dignity that I think every person deserves, especially if you're trying to build a strong and lasting solution in community. As long as there is a recognition that what these programs help provide is an ability for a people, a community, to maintain their dignity and their recognized value, then you actually then these projects can actually have more impact moving on out and make a difference. And I'll just conclude with you know why we're doing this. And I think it comes down to this slide of this young man, not so young anymore, but this he was a boy at the time in 2017. This is after Hurricane Maria. And what you're seeing over here behind him is actually a tube of water that was collected from on the upside on the high mountain. And then there was literally, you'd see like a mile worth of vehicles just waiting for people to collect up water. Uh, and this kind of like where we began was recognizing that energy, electricity is a linchpin on both extremes of a chain. And as we all know, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. But if you take one extreme of that chain, um, that one is actually what provides some of the essential services that start with is, for example, water. If you're in a mountainous area, you need pumps to be able to push that water up and down elevation. Well, not so much down, but up elevation. And those pumps are generally electric. And as soon as you lose electricity, you lose fresh water, fresh, clean water. When you lose fresh, clean water, the next thing that goes is community health. And we had this experience where we had a young 18-year-old. I mean, it was obvious when we were providing services there that there was going to be many more deaths than were initially reported by the government. But we did have an 18-year-old non-immunocompromised young man die of leptospirosis, and he lived in the center of the town. That is unusual in the best of respects. But these hurricanes will spread a lot of vectors around, and if you can't have clean water, then you sacrifice community health. And when you sacrifice community health, it's very difficult to have a discussion about economic activity. And then that economic activity is also a linchpin that needs electricity. Because in the 21st century, most all economic activity requires electricity as a fundamental input. So when we fast forward to 2022, where we have this young lady actually inaugurating our first microgrid, where those words that are there on that box that was prepared by children, it says lighting our future. You know, that contrast there is really what I think summarizes the why we have to do this. And by making sure that we don't allow the structures to repeat themselves, to put ourselves back into that 2017 position, then we have a very competitive reason for both of these young people to make a conscious decision to stay in the communities and live in the communities. And I imagine that most of the communities here that are part of this program suffer quite a bit from flight, people leaving for other economic, better ventures or perceptions, leaving behind a more vulnerable and aging population. And and that's not necessary. That doesn't have to be the case, because in the 21st century economy, where we're primarily providing services to each other, and most of that having to do more and more with information knowledge, there is a very compelling argument that one can make to highlight that any job can be done anywhere in most respects if you bring the right skill sets. And I think that in this case, when we look at the mountainous area, which is just beautiful to live in, there's no reason why we can't give these two young people a compelling and competitive reason to stay in the mountains, to create their family, and to make sure that these communities don't turn into aged communities that basically through morbidity pass out, and then they become shells of what they were. So I think we'll culminate with that.